So welcome, Rivkah. Rivkah is joining me today from the Judean Mountains, right? So Rivkah, would you introduce yourself and share a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my full name is Rivkah Lambert Adler, and I moved to Israel four, 14 years ago, almost 15 years ago, from the US. I grew up as a secular Jew. Like I knew that I was Jewish when I was born, but I had no Jewish education, and being Jewish wasn't particularly important to me until I was in my 20s or so. And in my evolution, my own spiritual evolution, I started actually after graduate school, I started to become interested in Judaism because I didn't know really much about it. And so I just started studying like it was another topic in university. And I took a class and I kept learning and growing and studying until I got to the point where I understood that the Torah's messages for the Jewish people are eternally relevant. And because I knew that I was a Jew, I I understood that those messages were applicable to me as well, and that that way of living was meant for me as well. And so I switched my life around in my 20s, and not completely, but I became an observant Jew, observant of the Torah commandments. And almost right away, I started running into an obstacle, and that was the attitude that I was seeing in a Torah world towards women. And that I would say was like my first of three, now I'm on my fourth, great passion in Judaism. So I worked on that for a while until I came to a place, a theological place of understanding why things look like they do in the relationship between masculine and feminine, not just in the Jewish world, but in the world in general. And it all goes back to the Garden of Eden, and it's a whole story. But I came to a place of relative peace. And then I started getting very intrigued by Israel. Now, at the time, I was living in America, and my children are fourth generation American, and I never anticipated ever living anywhere else
Mhm.
um, until September 11th, 2001, when having studied Jewish history, I suddenly came to understand that the United States was only the last in a series of host countries for the Jewish people, and that God really had a plan to link the Jewish people to the land of Israel,
Mhm.
and that the next stage of that became possible in 1948 when the Jewish people got dominion over the land of Israel again. And so I started to become obsessed about everything about Israel, to the point where ultimately I moved my family here.
Mhm.
And as part of that, I became this sort of my third great passion, so women, the land of Israel, and then redemption.
Mhm.
And I saw it somewhat when I lived in the US, but even more so when we moved to Israel, and I saw more and more people were seeing signs that all of the biblical prophecies that were relevant to the end of days were starting to become
Mhm.
obvious to us.
Right.
So I started teaching about it, writing about it, thinking about it, talking about it, learning about it, all that whole stuff. And here's how I got connected to Christ. This is a very long answer to who I am, but
Okay.
that's okay. How I got connected to Christians
Mhm.
was I was invited to start writing articles for a publication that is now called Israel 365 News. It was called Breaking Israel News
Mhm.
back in the day. But anyway, to write articles about what's going on in Israel and how it seems to be related to the messianic process unfolding.
Mhm.
And as a result of that, the readers, who were largely Christians who had a relationship with Israel, started contacting me. And this is way before COVID time, when people were routinely visiting Israel.
Mhm.
And they would say, "Oh, we're coming to Israel for this reason or that reason. And we read your articles and we'd love to meet you." And so I started meeting people who were reading the kinds of articles that I was writing, and they would tell me their stories. And they would say things like, I was raised as a Christian, but something is shifting, and I have this very strong pull towards Israel that I don't fully understand. And I also started doing some research into like Christian holidays, and discovering things that made me uncomfortable, that made me feel like these are pagan and I shouldn't be following them and they're not the way Jesus lived anyway, and started following. I'm sure you know, you're very familiar with this story, but it was brand new to me
Right.
when I started meeting people like this who were keeping what they call biblical feasts, which the Jewish
Mm,
people call the Chagim, or the Jewish holidays,
mhm.
that they were eating in a way that it wasn't kosher in the same way that my
Yeah.
family eats
Mhm.
kosher, but it was biblically clean,
Yeah.
and other kinds of practices that I always thought those are things Jews do. Like, I could not wrap my brain around the idea that there are people coming from, by and large, the Christian world who were doing like Jewish things and
Right.
were with no intention. They weren't like on a path to conversion. They were
Right.
trying to live in
Mm.
harmony, I guess is a way of describing it, with the way that they understood that Jesus lived as a Jew in this part of the world.
Right.
I live within spitting distance of Bethlehem.
Right.
You can throw a rock and basically, I wouldn't do it because it's kind of politically charged right now, but that's how close that I
Yeah.
live to Bethlehem. So I was a journalist and I said, this is a really interesting phenomenon. I know most Jews know nothing about this because I knew nothing about it.
Mm.
And so I wanted to write an article about it. And I posted, as I often do when I'm looking for sources to interview, I posted something on Facebook saying, do you know anybody like this who comes from the Christian world but does these biblical holidays, or eats biblically clean, or studies the Torah portion of the week or whatever?
Mm.
And actually, it was our mutual friend Guido who said to me, there's more than an article here. This is a full-blown book. And the way that God orchestrated my life at that time, I was recovering from knee surgery and wasn't working in my normal jobs. And so I had time. And so I put together a book that um, well, hang on just a second. I should have prepared this before, but it's called 10 from the
Yeah.
Nations, Light,
I read that. Mm.
Torah Awakening Among the Non-Jews. This is actually the second edition because I expanded it from the first edition because there were more stories to tell and
Mm.
updates on people's stories. But basically, it's the story of people who are either current or former Christians who are on some kind of a walk with Torah.
Mm.
And then after that, I understood that the Jewish people had a responsibility. Let me backtrack and say, you're familiar with this term. It comes from the Bible, the being a light to the nations, that
Yeah.
that is God's charge to the Jewish people. And what I used to think is what that meant was we're supposed to come to Israel, build this perfect society based on Torah values, and the whole world would admire it so much that they
Mhm.
would say, oh, we want to be like that. We want a culture like that. We want a society like that. That's what I used to think it meant. So it was sort of, we do our thing and other people observe us from afar.
Right.
And then I came to understand very differently that because I started meeting people that were actually interested in hearing what Jews had to say, which is kind of novel in the last 2000 years.
Right.
And I understood that the Jewish people had a responsibility towards the nations today and as the messianic process unfolds. And so I wrote this, or edited this other book called Lighting Up the
Mhm.
Nations, and the subtitle is Jewish Responsibility Toward the Nations Today in the Messianic Era. And it's all about what are the Jews supposed to do to help people who are interested in knowing what God's word actually means, because of course it was written in Hebrew and the Jewish people were are the people who understand it best. And I used to think, and I think a lot of Jewish people feel this way, that the Torah, the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, whatever you call it, was given to the Jewish people as our exclusive property.
Mhm.
And it didn't really have anything to do with the rest of the world. And other religions had their own holy
Mhm.
scriptures and so forth. But then I understood that that was a mistaken idea, and that the if you look at the beginning of history, the beginning of when God created the world, the truth is that he intended he intended the Torah for the whole world,
Mm,
and a lot of people failed. One of the most famous ones is Noah, who was supposed
mhm,
to teach the whole world, and he did not succeed in that mission. And so 20 generations went by before God gave the mission of spreading his wisdom to the whole world to Abraham.
yeah,
And that begins the story of the Jewish people, basically.
right.
But all along, it has been our job to share the universal wisdom of Torah with everybody who's interested in hearing it all over the world. But once Christianity came, and we were doing that to some extent, but once Christianity came onto the scene, it became dangerous
Mhm,
to do that in ways that I don't want to detail, but there was a lot of anti-Semitic violence towards the Jewish community, and so the Jewish community retracted and said, "We just leave us alone.
yeah,
We're just going to stay to ourselves," and so forth. But because redemption is unfolding, and because the truth of God's messages for the world have to get out there, something's happening in the Christian world now. I have met in my work a few people coming from the Muslim world, and there might be people from other religions, but I'm most familiar with the Christian
mhm,
side of people coming from Christian backgrounds, like the people that I was meeting,
mm,
who really actually genuinely want to study Bible
right.
with the Jewish people. But there
Mm,
aren't that many people who are like so interested in interacting because as you can imagine, most Jewish people have in their head it is not safe
mm.
to interact with Christians, for good reason that they feel that way.
Because of the
But that
past,
is
right?
because of the past,
Yeah.
and also because of the number of, like here in Israel, we have a lot of missions, a
Mm,
lot of ministries that are devoted to trying to turn Jews into Christians. And
mhm,
that is something that no Jew has any tolerance for. And so we tend as a people, I think this is sort of human nature, to brush all Christians with the same paint, and to say, well, all Christians, they only want to evangelize us.
mm,
And so it's just best to stay away from them. But over the years that I've been doing this work, I have found that is really not true. And so I understood that part of being a light to the nations means bringing the light of Torah to the nations. It does not mean trying to make all Christians or all people into Jews. That's not
mm,
even
mm,
remotely a goal of the Torah. But there is what I call the universal wisdom of Torah that is intended for the whole world. And so that's what I've been doing lately is working with people that come from the Christian world who are interested in learning what how Jews understand the Bible,
right.
and trying to make that happen for them. And I do that in a number of different ways. That's a really long answer to your very
But
first
I've
question.
got answers to many of the questions I wanted to ask anyway, so that's great, without people having to hear my voice. But one of the things you mentioned, it's a very important point, because I find it like in my um, I'm trying to achieve a platform for connecting people. And often it is, yes, there are a lot of Christians who love Israel, but ultimately the goal is to evangelize, and
Right.
I'll say this openly. And I find that frustrating because I'm like, why don't you just learn from there? In fact, in the New Testament also, it's been said the law will go forth from Jerusalem unto all the world. So that is, I understood that also as a lighting up the nations, but um, I want whoever is listening, I want them to hear this out that it is frustrating for the Jewish people when people come with an agenda, you know, that, okay, everything good, but ultimately you need to convert. So I just wish, steps like these would actually um, allow people to really hear each other out. To my next question, actually, in Zechariah chapter 8, verse 23, it talks about the 10 from the nations hanging on to one Yehudi or one Jew. And How do you see that practically unfolding in our times, or do you see that happening already?
I do see it happening already, but I want to tell you a funny story. One time I was teaching a group of Christians, and they were in Israel. They were visiting Israel, and I went to where they were having their conference to give a talk. And this one woman told me she was walking in the street of Jerusalem, and she saw a man with tzitzit, with the fringes hanging from his hanging on his clothing above his pants, and she understood this verse and she wanted to go up to him and like grab them, literally. But she was a little embarrassed to do that. And I said, it's a very good thing that you didn't actually do that because it's a metaphor. It's not meant to be taken literally.
Yeah.
And as we are two women speaking about this, so women in Judaism do not wear that garment, but
Mm,
it's a metaphor for the nation's um, sharing a destiny with or clinging to the wisdom of the Torah that the Jews have a responsibility to share with the world. And so the way that I see it happening here, this is my story,
mhm,
is that so I'm pretty active on Facebook.
mhm,
And years ago, I started getting messages from non-Jews, private messages, asking me questions about Judaism or about Israel, whatever. And I thought, I don't have, these are not people I had a relationship with. These are people who found me out of the blue.
mm,
And I thought, this is very strange. Like, I'm clearly not the only Jewish person on Facebook. Why are these questions coming to me? I didn't understand until later I understood that God was preparing me for something. And so I think that there are certain people like you and like me from different sides of from different communities that understand and feel a sort of energetic pull towards each other that is God working in the world. Now,
mm,
it doesn't happen for everybody. Not everybody feels it. And the vast majority of Christians still feel like evangelizing Jews is what they're
mm,
supposed to do. And the vast majority of Jews still feel like staying away from Christians
right.
because they have to preserve Judaism is what
Mhm,
they're supposed to do. But there are many people, and I would say millions of people like you and like me who are finding each other and saying something's going on and something new is opening. And that's how I understand this fulfillment. What I think is as the messianic process continues, it will become more and more common to have the kinds of dialogues that you have with Jews on a regular basis and that I have with Christians on a regular basis. But right now, it's sort of the tip of the iceberg. It's like just starting to happen.
right.
Um, when I say now, I mean like over the last 10 years or so,
Mhm,
but it's picking up steam, and I'm meeting more and more people who were raised as Christians who are intrigued by and not trying to wash all Jews in the blood of Jesus, are willing to set that agenda aside in order to learn. And that's what I think is happening, and that's what I think is the fulfillment of that prophecy. But it's happening not like all of a sudden everybody woke up and now the whole world wants to um, turn to the Torah, but it's a little at a time, which is good because we all need preparation. We all need to practice on a smaller scale
right.
before we're ready to do this on a bigger scale,
Yeah.
because there are mistakes that get made, there are feelings that get hurt. Like
Mhm,
everybody that I know, whether it's from the Christian side or the Jewish side, finds this work of building bridges controversial.
yeah.
And there are people in their lives that don't understand, and
Mm,
people who don't want to have anything to do with them anymore, or who accuse us of various things. I've been accused of being a missionary myself, secretly trying to bring Jews to Christianity.
Oh, really?
Yes, I was, but I've also, at the same time, I've been accused of trying to convert people, like deceptively trying to convert Christians to Judaism, which is so
Mhm,
not even remotely true, um, and have lost friends and so forth. However, I've also met a lot of really fascinating people whose souls are very much propelling them forward in whatever this phenomenon is.
right.
And I'm really so honored that Hashem picked me, God picked me to be part of this conversation because it's very exciting stuff
Yeah.
and very very spiritually rewarding.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that's excellent. And ultimately, at whatever level Christians are following Jesus, there's an undeniable fact here that Jesus was Jewish, born in Bethlehem of Judea, the New Testament says. And well, I don't celebrate Christmas as in Christmas as Christians understand, because I see differently when I read the New Testament also from a Jewish context. I see, like, again, it has to do with the father of John, who was a priest in the temple, and when his duty was, and then through that you can make out when Jesus's birth could have been. But these are things that you can't really discuss with people because everybody's at a different stage. But as I said, the fact is that Jesus was Jewish, and a lot of the things that were done in his times, in fact, all of it was from a Jewish context. Not even like Shabbat, whatever was done or not done. Why was Jesus hanging around in the temples? What was he doing in the synagogues teaching? And all these things. So, but there's one thing, you mentioned the term messianic a few times so far. And the word messianic has a different connotation in the Christian
right.
context. Okay, so also messianic, people call messianic Jews, messianic believers. Also, that is the messianic um, aspect. So, I would like to ask you, what is the Jewish perspective of messianic when you say messianic?
Okay. So, one time I was doing an interview with a Christian interviewer, and I used the term believer, and
Hmm.
I meant somebody who believes in God.
Hmm.
And he stopped the recording, and he said, "You can't say that because Christians will hear that as a believer in Jesus."
Jesus, yeah.
And I found that very ironic. But anyway, this is another one of those words that so the whole concept is that the world needs redemption. Okay. And I'm speaking now completely from a Jewish perspective. It is clear that the world needs redemption, that we have a lot of evil, a lot of chaos, and especially now in the
Mhm.
world. And that was always part of God's plan, is to introduce a messianic redeemer. Now, in Jewish understanding, that messianic redeemer is a human being, a fully human being,
Mhm.
born of human parents, who is learned in Torah, who is righteous in deeds, and whose job it is to affect the um, the redemption of the world. So he's God's partner in the world, and there's a number of criteria for who the messianic redeemer is, and one of the reasons why consistently Jews who know anything about Torah are unable to accept Jesus as this personality, as this messianic redeemer, is because in the book of Isaiah we have certain qualifications,
Mhm.
and Jesus doesn't meet those qualifications. So but we are still anticipating, we the Jewish people are anticipating a messianic redeemer, a human being who I think is alive today and walking on the earth, but he hasn't been designated, maybe doesn't know who he is.
Okay.
There's actually a Jewish concept that there is a potential Messiah in every generation,
Mhm.
because if the world is ready. And what the what that ultimately means is that all of the hardships that people experience, all of the illness and poverty and war and racism and sexism and everything that's negative in the human experience will disappear. And everybody in the Messianic era will be working on their relationship with God and growing spiritually. And the material world, which right now has so much power,
Mhm.
will be less powerful, and the spiritual values of the world will be much more powerful. And we're all looking forward to that, and we all see signs of it. And I think that's true on the Christian side and on the Jewish side. The question is who we think is going to lead us there.
Right.
So when I say messianic, I don't in any way, I'm not thinking about Jesus. I'm thinking about the Jewish understanding of this human who will be so charismatic, so knowledgeable about Torah, so connected to God that he will be able to inspire the world to move forward in history and will fix all of the conflicts that we have with one another and lead us into a more godly existence. So
Okay. And do you also believe that the temple will be rebuilt and the Messiah will reign from there as an earthly king?
okay, I definitely believe in I mean, I believe this because it's what the Torah tells me, that there will be a third temple that will be
Mhm.
forever, that will not. So the first two temples in Jerusalem were temporary, obviously, and they were destroyed. But the third temple will be eternal, and that the it will be the center of connection to God for everybody. So you mentioned before something from the New Testament. I have to tell you, I've never read the New Testament, but I always have the impression that as a Torah observant Jew, I would understand the
Mhm.
context of a lot of it
Yeah.
more than an average Christian
Yeah.
because of my background in Torah and not just me, like any Torah Jew would.
Mhm.
But yes, so I believe that that will be the heart and soul of the messianic kingdom.
Mm.
And that, but it's not just a Jewish thing. This is another thing a lot of Jews don't understand. They think that redemption, which we call in Hebrew Geulah,
Mm.
is only has to do with the Jews, but it doesn't. It has to
Mm.
do with the whole world and aligning the whole world with the vision of God.
Mm.
Not everybody in the end of days needs to be Jewish, but everybody needs to be aligned with the God of Israel,
Mm.
who is
Mhm.
the God of the world, who is the
Mhm.
creator and the sustainer of the world. And
Mhm.
so that's the universal vision, not
Right.
that everybody becomes Jewish, and certainly
Right.
not that everybody's a Christian.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. That was really interesting. And I would really hope that more Christians would take the time to really hear what you said again, because it's important. Um, Also, now you mentioned Isaiah, some verses from Isaiah that you believe that the Messiah needs to fulfill. Isaiah is actually one of the prophets that Christians also like to quote about Jesus, that Jesus has fulfilled. Um, I think, like, in fact, some Christians get angry when they hear that I interact with Jews and they say, but why don't they believe in Jesus? Because Isaiah says this, this, this. I'm like, actually, they are probably expecting a Jewish Messiah, and you made Jesus has become so Christian. Like he never came to be Christian, right? But yeah, I mean, what do you think are the criteria from the Torah perspective or the Tanakh, the Hebrew Tanakh perspective?
Well, it's not what I think, it's what Isaiah says. So, um, so the very first one is um, that the Messiah, now, not to confuse things, but in Jewish thinking, there are actually two messianic personalities.
Hmm.
I don't know if you know this idea. There's what we call Mashiach ben Yosef, the
Hmm.
Messiah, son of Joseph,
Hmm.
who is descended from Joseph.
Hmm.
And he's a preparatory messianic figure
Hmm.
that gets the world ready for when we talk about Mashiach, Messiah, we're mostly talking about Mashiach ben David,
Hmm.
okay? So that Messiah has to be physically descended from King David.
Hmm.
Now, we count um in the Jewish world, we count that through the father.
Hmm.
So it's a little confusing because Judaism, whether you are part of the Jewish people or not part of the Jewish people, depends on your mother.
Hmm.
Um, and if your mother was Jewish, you're automatically Jewish no matter what you believe, whatever. But your lineage
Hmm.
comes from your father's side. Okay. So the very first criteria, according to Jews, now Jesus doesn't meet. Okay, because if Jesus doesn't have a human father, then he can't possibly be descended from the line of David. I just want to say that I personally, there are people who are very expert in explaining better why Jews don't believe in Jesus and so
Mhm.
forth. That is not my area of expertise,
Okay.
so I'm gonna sidestep that
Okay.
a little bit and just say that I it is um, it is a well-established belief in the Jewish world that Jesus does not fulfill the criteria, Isaiah's criteria for messiahship,
Mhm.
and um, and that's why we're still waiting.
Right.
But there are many overlaps. There are many parallels between what Jews believe will happen at the end of days and what Christians believe in terms of the goodness of it. And
Mhm.
we're all anxiously awaiting it. And um, obviously, I have my theological understanding of what I think is going to happen with other religions. Um, but right now, where we are now, my interest is primarily, I'm not trying to convince anybody not to believe in Jesus,
Mhm.
not to be a Christian. I'm interested only in sharing Torah
Mhm.
as authentically as I can with people who come from a Christian background. And I used to think that the biggest divide between Jews and Christians was this issue
Yeah.
of Jesus. But I actually think there's another one that is kind of major when it comes to Bible study,
Mhm.
and that is, what is the role of the oral Torah?
Mhm.
So I want to tell you a story. I was speaking to a group of Christians who were visiting a different group than the one with the woman who wanted to pull on the seat of the man in Jerusalem. And I had this idea that maybe I would do a program that would be a whole Shabbat experience. We would go to some kibbutz together. Everybody would have their own room, and we would have these programs. And I'd have Jewish teachers come, and we'd have our meals together, and we'd have like a Shabbat experience, Jews and Christians together.
Mhm.
And so I was sharing this idea as I was thinking about it with this group, and I said, "Do you think this is a good idea?" And one of the women in the back raised her hand and she said, "That would be very interesting to me as long as you don't teach Talmud."
Mhm.
And I said, "Well, I didn't understand where that was coming from." I said, "Well, like, what do you mean exactly?" And she said, "Well, the Talmud is filled with demons and witchcraft. I don't know." She said a whole, this may not be news to you, but when I heard it, I almost fell off my chair
Mhm.
because the Talmud, of course, in the Jewish world has a place of honor. And I understood that Christians were taught that everything that is outside of the Bible, outside of the written Bible, is has no validity, is maybe even not just not valid, but also um, to be avoided at all
Yeah.
costs.
Mhm.
And what was astonishing to me is that is so not a Jewish way of thinking,
Mhm.
because when we have children, our children, when they are educated in Bible,
Mhm.
they are educated with the biblical text and also rabbinic commentary
Mhm.
from their very earliest stages. So it is impossible to understand how Jews understand the Bible without understanding the oral tradition. And in fact, I make the case in this book, in Lighting Up the Nations, that there's lots of stuff in the Bible you cannot understand without knowing the oral tradition, which is now written down and is accessible in writing. So that's another sort of stumbling block when studying Bible together,
Mhm.
between Jews and Christians, is um, to get Jews, I'm sorry, to get Christians to appreciate the role. They don't have to believe in it, they don't have to accept it, but they have to understand. If you ever want to know how a Jew studies Bible, how a Jew understands what the Bible says, you have to accept the premise that for Jews, the oral Torah is also part of the story.
Right. Mhm. Yeah, that's a very important point. I mean, I knew about the fact that Christians, or at least the Bible reading Christians, they're very particular, like nothing outside of the written Bible. But I had never heard what this lady said, the Talmud is filled with demons and whatnot. I mean,
I really almost fell off my chair. I couldn't. but it's apparently something I've heard it many times since then. And I think it was a way of the church keeping people away from anything rabbinic,
Right.
and by demonizing it, literally.
Mm. Yeah, well, all this sounds very exciting, and I would you share your maybe email? How can people contact you if they want to know more about the
Sure.
Torah?
Let me say this. I'm happy to. I'm also working on a couple of other book projects that are all related to this. And I want to tell you about one of them, and then I'll give you my email address and tell you what else I'm doing. So one of the books that I'm working on is called Women from the Nations in the Hebrew Bible, and it relates to this conversation. What I did was I picked 10 women in Hebrew scripture
Mm,
that are not born into the Israelite nation. Okay, so
mm,
they come from other nations, and I tell their stories. Now, I know that Christians know Bible, and I know that Christians know the basic story of, let's say, Orpah is one of them.
mm,
Okay, what is Orpah's story? She is in the book of Ruth, right? She's the sister of Ruth. She's the wife of the other brother, and she appears at the very beginning of the book of Ruth, and then she turns away from Ruth and Naomi and she goes away.
mhm,
And that's the last we hear from her when it comes to
mhm,
Bible. But in our rabbinic tradition, there's a whole story of what happens to her after she turns away, which I'm not going to go into because that's what's in the book.
mhm,
But there's two reasons why I'm developing this book. One is because, number one, I think that the women in Tanakh, the women in Hebrew scriptures, they don't get enough play.
mhm,
They aren't taught often enough. And the ones that are taught over and over again, like Sarah and Rivkah, Rebecca, and
mhm,
so forth. And not that they're not important, but I wanted to bring some light to other women's stories, but also because I wanted to use that as a vehicle to teach Christians how Jews understand the Bible. That it's
mm,
not just, it is the literal words on the page, but not only. That there's a
right.
whole backstory that exists in our rabbinic tradition. And so I bring that to the table. So that book is forthcoming, hopefully in the next year. Women from the nations in the land of
Mhm, very interesting.
women in the Hebrew Bible, women from the nations in the Hebrew Bible. Um, and the other thing is that I understood that there are people from the Christian world that have given up replacement theology, given up the idea that all Jews need to become Christians,
Mhm,
and genuinely want to forge a relationship with Jews and genuinely want to learn how Jews understand things. And so I started a class shortly after the war started. I started teaching a class on Tuesday nights, Israel time, on Tuesday nights for women who are not Jewish, but who are interested in studying Torah.
mhm,
And I'm saying that to invite women from your audience who might be interested to be in touch with me to see if this class might work for them. There's no charge for it, and it's just an opportunity for women who do want to build a relationship with the Jewish people
mhm,
to connect
right.
in some way. So here's my email address.
Mhm.
It's Rivkah, Rivkah, Rivkah at Kotevet, Kotevet.com. Rivkah@kotevet.com. Maybe you have a way of putting
I'll
that
write
in
it down
notes or
also.
something.
Yeah, maybe
Okay.
I'll say if anybody's interested, and then I can pass on the.
I'm also on Facebook, Rivkah Lambert Adler.
Okay.
And people can message me there as well if they're
Okay.
interested in the books that I have published so far are on Amazon, and that's where the ones that I'm working on will also be, because I really think that it is very important that people who are coming from the Christian world, who are intrigued by Israel, who are intrigued by the Jewish people, who want to follow the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob,
Mhm.
however they understand that, um, that they know that there are Jews who are receptive. It's not all Jews, and you can't just
Right.
go, tap the shoulder of your neighborhood Jew and because uh, a lot of Jews, unfortunately, don't have a Torah background
Yeah.
themselves. But there are Jews like me, English speaking. Many of us grew up in outside of Israel. They grew up in the UK or in Europe or in the United States or in Canada, and are now living in the land of Israel. And we do want to have relationships and build relationships with Christians who are interested in talking to us. So, so thank you for the work that you're doing, because it's so incredibly important for every one of us to reach the people that we can reach. And
Right.
you're gonna help me do that,
Mm.
and reach people that otherwise wouldn't know about me and my work.
Yeah.
And I hope that that is an encouragement and a blessing for everyone.
Yeah. And ultimately, you know, we worship the God of Israel, you know, at least you and I mean, we have that in common, right? And the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So thank you so much, Rivka,
My
for
pleasure.
joining me. I really appreciate it.